We have now come to chapter 2 in our study of the book of Daniel. Now, if you'll remember, Daniel is a book that teaches us that God is in control. It was written when Israel was thrown into exile, taken away from their homeland, and captured by Babylon because they were wicked and they didn't listen to God. And so the Israelites are wondering as these events are going on in Daniel, where is God? Does he love us still? Is he with us still, even though we're in exile? And they're also wondering, well, we're in exile. How are we supposed to live now? Separated from the temple, separated from all these religious things, separated from people who are supposed to be godly in the midst of this harsh, scary pagan world. How do we live in honor to God? And we've now come to chapter 2, where I get to explain how I got paid to color something as a college graduate. And so I'm going to start reading for us in chapter 2, starting in verse 1. And the second year of his reign, King Nebuchadnezzar had dreams that troubled him, and sleep deserted him. So the king gave orders to summon the magicians, mediums, sorcerers, and Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. When they came and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream and am anxious to understand it. So let's start here. First of all, Nebuchadnezzar, of course, is the king of Babylon, the king who God allowed to capture Israel. And he had a dream. Now, in the ancient world, dreams were very important. It's actually pretty common in the Bible where somebody has a weird dream and some godly person has to come along and give them the interpretation of it. And so Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, as we're going to figure out, it's a pretty weird one. And so he's very anxious about it. He wants to know what it means, and he can't figure it out. So he summons basically as his court of wizards. He gets the magicians, mediums, sorcerers, and Chaldeans. He gets everybody to come in and try to tell him this dream and what it means. So we see in verse 4, the Chaldean spoke to the king, May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. Which is pretty reasonable, right? He had this dream, so they're saying, well, tell us what you dreamt, and we'll tell you what it means. But the king doesn't like that. Look at verse 5. The king replied to the Chaldeans, My word is final. If you don't tell me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a garbage dump. Nebuchadnezzar does this a couple chapters later. I like to think this is a phrase he uses often. Ancient kings were very mean, very impatient fellas. So what the king is saying is, if you don't tell me what I dreamed and what it means, I'm going to destroy you. But here's the good news. If you make the dream and its interpretation known to me, you'll receive gifts, a reward, and great honor. So make the dream and its interpretation known to me. He answered a second time, May the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will make known the interpretation. Here's something good to know about ancient kings. If you tell them something and they don't like it, don't repeat it. That's a bad idea. They're very angry people. And so verse 8, the king replied, I know for certain you are trying to gain some time because you see that my word is final. If you don't tell me my dream, there is one decree for you. You have conspired to tell me something false or fraudulent until the situation changes. So tell me the dream, and then I'll know you can give me its interpretation. So the king is afraid they're just going to give him some meaning of the dream that will flatter him. Oh, king, your dream means that you are the greatest king, that you'll rule forever, and that nobody would ever oppose you. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't want that. He wants the facts. But here's the problem. The Chaldeans answered the king, No one on earth can make known what the king requests. Consequently, that means because of this, no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked this of any magician, medium, or Chaldean. What the king is asking is so difficult that no one can make known to him except the gods, whose dwelling is not with mortals. Because of this, the king was violently angry and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. The decree was issued that the wise men were to be executed, and they searched for Daniel and his friends to execute them. So the court of wizards tells the king, nobody can make this known to you, king. Nobody can crawl around inside of your head and figure out what you dreamed last night. That's why nobody, not even the best of kings, has ever asked this of anyone. But again, ancient kings, they have short temper, big pride. And so Nebuchadnezzar doesn't like this, and he just decides, well, then I'll kill all of them. Another thing about ancient kings, they're not the brightest sometimes. Nebuchadnezzar, if you kill your entire court of wise men, who's going to advise you? It's not a great idea, but this is what Nebuchadnezzar does anyways. And the bad news for us as people who are rooting for our boy Daniel is that they're going to destroy Daniel too as one of the wise men. Now, apparently, Daniel and his friends weren't part of the group that was summoned to advise the king. Perhaps it's because the king looked down on the Jewish folks. Perhaps it's because they were busy. Whatever the case, they weren't able to come advise the king. But we see that Daniel's not going to just lay down and die. So verse 14, Daniel responded with tact and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to execute the wise men of Babylon. Tact and discretion, that's essentially a way of being polite, of being gracious. So he asked Arioch, the king's officer, why is the decree from the king so harsh? Then Arioch explained the situation to Daniel. So Daniel went and asked the king to give him some time so he could give the king the interpretation. Now I want to show you just how bold Daniel is. Again, remember, Daniel knows that in spite of this exile, God is with the people who love and trust and follow him. And so Daniel knows whatever happens, God has got me in his hands. Daniel also knows that as somebody who loves God, he has to live faithfully, even in exile. And so the guy with the axe comes out to start collecting people to chop their heads off. And Daniel says, whoa, 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 what's going on? And because God is with Daniel, somehow he's able to talk to the headsman and not only get a pardon from him, but be able to go ask the king for a pardon, which is just remarkable. This is the guy who said, I'll tear you limb from limb and make your house as a garbage dump. Yet he's patient with Daniel. Remarkable how God is working in this situation. And we're going to see Daniel's work, God is working even more remarkably, because in verse 17, Daniel went to his house and told his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, urging them to ask the God of heavens for mercy concerning this mystery. So Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of Babylon's wise men. Daniel knows nothing within himself is good enough to do this impossible thing, but he knows God can do it. Now you remember, the wise men of Babylon said, nobody can tell you this dream and what it means except the gods, whose dwelling is not with mortals. And although the real God, the one true God of heavens, is not physically there walking around with Daniel and his buddies all the time, like he's just another person, but God is with his people, and Daniel and his buddies know this, and so they go to pray to him. And here's something, a good lesson for you all watching, a good lesson I told my students when they were in the class, is that every now and then there's going to be a mean old man in charge of the whole world, and he's going to try to kill you and make your house a garbage dump, and you need to get together with your youth group buddies and pray with them. So come to Poplar Level Baptist Church and join our class. Verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. So he got his friends together, and finally God answers this because they prayed to him, they trusted him, they knew nothing within us could answer this mystery, but God can. And Daniel praised the God of heavens. So here's the formula we have. There's a problem, okay? There's a problem that Daniel and his friends have. And so they go to God in prayer. Then the mystery is answered, and so they praise God. Because they know they don't deserve to have this mystery answered to them. As sinful people, they deserve nothing less than death and separation from God. Yet God loves them so much that he is with them and working in them and answers this mystery. And here's what Daniel praises God. This is a beautiful hymn, poem, whatever you want to call it, and it really encapsulates the entire message of Daniel. May the name of God be praised forever and ever. For wisdom and power belong to him. He changes the times and seasons. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals the deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I offer thanks and praise to you, God of my fathers, because you've given me wisdom and power. And now you have let known what we ask of you, for you have let us know the king's mystery. So when Daniel's praising God, he says, first of all, may the name of God be praised forever and ever. Daniel is a man. He will die. His life is very short, but he knows God is eternal. Wisdom and power belong to God. Nebuchadnezzar has power. Daniel has wisdom, yet the only reason either of them have these things is because God has granted it to them. As we saw in chapter 1, the Lord gave. He removes kings and establishes kings. Yes, even the wicked King Nebuchadnezzar. You want to know how bad Nebuchadnezzar was? He captured Israel. He made the king watch his sons die in front of him, and then jabbed his eyes out and drug him into exile. This is the kind of evil that Daniel's dealing with, and Daniel says, God removes kings and establishes kings. That happened because God allowed it, and God is bigger than that. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. God is the one who reveals mystery, who gives insight, who gives wisdom. And so the rest of Daniel's praise very much mirrors what we've already talked about. So we read in verse 24, therefore Daniel went to Arioch, and that's the captain of the king's guard. He came and said to him, don't destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me before the king, and I will give him its interpretation. So Arioch brings him before the king. And the king said in reply to Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, remember that Nebuchadnezzar gave the exiles new names. Names not about the one true God, but about the Babylonian gods. And so Daniel comes up as somebody named after a false god in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, and he's going to tell Nebuchadnezzar about the true God. Are you able to tell me the dream I had and its interpretation and its meaning? Daniel answered the king, this is a good one, no wise man, medium, magician, or diviner is able to make known to the king the mystery he asked about. Nebuchadnezzar got so mad when his other guys said that, he said, well, then kill all of them. But Daniel, again, has this boldness to know that he's going to go forward in God's truth, and God's got his hand on him, whatever happens. Verse 28, here's the good news. But, although no man can make this known, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has let King Nebuchadnezzar know what will happen in these last days. And so he says a little bit later, the revealer of mysteries has let you know what will happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but in order that the interpretation might be made known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. So again, we know that Nebuchadnezzar is in power and is able to take Israel into captivity because God's allowed it. There's nothing within Nebuchadnezzar that's hot stuff. It's only God that's allowing him to do these things. And we read in Jeremiah that God wants Babylon to be an instrument of the discipline of his people. Discipline is not a punishment. It's something that helps you see what is right. So, for example, a timeout when you're a kid, not a fun experience, but if you sit in timeout enough times, you're going to stop doing the bad thing that sends you into timeout. And it's going to turn out better for you because you'll behave and be able to be part of a regular society. Well, similarly, God said, if they're sinning so much, I'm going to punish them, and maybe finally they'll get that they shouldn't sin against me, and they'll live the right way. But God wanted Nebuchadnezzar to be an instrument that actually knew him. And so everything that's going to happen in the first 4 chapters of Daniel, it's God trying to show Nebuchadnezzar, this is who I am. Love me, trust me, follow me. And so the reason Nebuchadnezzar gets to know this mystery is because God's trying to tell Nebuchadnezzar, I'm bigger than you, and I still want to love you, even you, Nebuchadnezzar, you wicked, evil king. And so in verse 31 to 33, we have a description, and that's where my beautiful statue comes in. I can't remove it. We'll do this. And so essentially, Daniel's going to describe that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and there's a big statue, and it's made of these different materials. So the head is gold, the chest is silver, the thighs are bronze, the legs are iron, and the feet are iron and clay mixed together. Well, that's a little bit odd, but just dreaming about a big statue, I guess that's okay. But maybe in verse 34, this is why Nebuchadnezzar gets concerned. As you are watching the statue, a stone broke off without a hand touching it. And it struck the statue on its feet of iron and fired clay and crushed them. And then he says, every material in the statue, it was destroyed, it was shattered, it was blown away like chaff in the wind. It's essentially the parts of a crop you wouldn't eat. It's just debris flowing away. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. God has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and glory. He has handed everything in the world over to you and made you ruler of them all. You are the head of gold. After you, there will arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule the whole earth. A fourth kingdom will be as strong as iron, for iron crushes and shatters everything, and like iron that smashes, it will crush and smash all the others. You saw the feet and toes, partly of clay, partly of iron. It will be a divided kingdom, though some strength of iron will be left in it. Part of the kingdom will be strong, and part will be brittle. The peoples will not mix with one another, will mix with one another, but won't hold together, just as iron doesn't mix with fired clay. And so in the midst of Daniel talking about this, we see that God not only is with the Israelites in exile, God is actually with his people in the grand scheme of human history. And so if we bring this up here, there we go. So the head of gold, as Daniel says, represents Babylon. And then we get 3 or maybe 4 other kingdoms mentioned after it. We don't actually know explicitly from the text who they are, but we can look in world history and see what's going on. And so after Babylon reigns, then there's the Medo-Persian Empire. And then after that is Greece, which does rule the whole earth. You remember Alexander the Great, he conquers the whole known world, and then he weeps, for there were no more worlds to conquer. And then finally we have this strong kingdom that crushes everything, and that's Rome. Rome was so in control of the world that when Jesus comes along to save people from their sin, the Israelites think he's come to defeat the Roman Empire because it's such a great evil. And then finally we have iron and clay, a kingdom of a lot of people that won't mix well together. And so that's either speaking of Rome, because eventually Rome was torn apart by divisions of people because they weren't unified. And so bits and bits of Rome fell until the whole thing kind of fell apart. Or it could be just the world after Rome, that there hasn't really been a great world superpower controlling everything since the Roman Empire collapsed. Whatever the case, though, God knows what's going to happen. His hand is on history. And even though all these kingdoms are going to fade, here's the good news. In the days of those kings, the God of heavens will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And this kingdom will not be left to another people. It will crush all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, but will itself endure forever. You saw a stone break off from the mountain without a hand touching it, and it crushed the iron, bronze, fire, clay, silver, and gold. The great God has told the king what will happen in the future. The dream is certain, and its interpretation reliable. So here's what we see about these kingdoms. So in the midst of all of these kingdoms that will eventually be destroyed, inherited by another empire, and then last only a short while, God's going to set up a kingdom that will come and destroy all these other kingdoms, and it will endure forever. Now, if we read Daniel with the whole Bible in mind, because of course the Bible is a book made up of smaller books written at different times by different people for different reasons, all sharing the same message, Daniel, even though it was written hundreds of years before Jesus came to earth, is actually talking about the reign of Jesus the King, because Jesus comes in and establishes his kingdom on earth. And even though there's war, there's famine, there's sickness, there's division, everyone who loves and trusts and follows Jesus will be held securely by him, will be safe in the midst of everything, and his kingdom will never end. Verse 46, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell face down, worshipped Daniel, gave orders to present an offering and incense to him. The king said to Daniel, your God indeed is God of gods, Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, since you were able to reveal this mystery. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many generous gifts. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon, and the chief governor over all the wise men of Babylon. At Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's the Babylonian names for Daniel's friends, to manage the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. So here's what we see. Nebuchadnezzar, the ancient king, who's all concerned about his kingdom, his rule, his power, has just been told, your kingdom's not going to last. The kingdom after that isn't going to last. Not even the kingdom after that one is going to last. And God's going to come down and strike these kingdoms with a kingdom that will never end. Nebuchadnezzar has just been told everything you're working for is going to go away and it won't matter. Yet Nebuchadnezzar bows down, worships Daniel. Now this is interesting. We certainly don't believe that people should be worshipped. But perhaps in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, since he's a little bit confused on the religion stuff. Remember, this is the guy who collects gods like Pokemon cards. Perhaps he is worshiping Daniel as a representative of God. And it would certainly make sense because he worships Daniel, yet then he gives his praise about God. And so this is likely what's happening. So Daniel is learning something about God, that God is bigger than him, that God reveals mysteries nobody else can. And then he appoints Daniel to rule over all of Babylon, and he appoints his friends to rule as well. And Daniel remains at the king's court at this place of influence. You see, even though God has temporarily let his people suffer, he's still with them, those who love him and trust him and are faithful to him. And if we live faithfully in the midst of that, God's going to secure us because we know we're not working for this kingdom right now, but for the kingdom that will never end. And in the meantime, when we're in this exile, in this strange world full of sinful people, God will even give us places where we can influence people to know who God is. And so that's what's happening in Daniel. In the midst of this hard time, God's saying, if you follow me, if you trust in me, I'm going to hold you. Don't work for this kingdom here. Work for me, and I'll give you my kingdom. But we know ultimately that we can't ever work enough for God. Like I said, we're sinful people. We deserve death. But the good news is that Jesus comes, and Jesus lives a perfect sinless life, and he dies, and he raises from the dead, and he establishes his kingdom. And if we're all sold out to that kingdom, if we turn from our sins and follow Jesus, there's nothing in the world, not even our own sin, that can take us away from him. And so that's Daniel 2. That's the message of Daniel, the message of the Bible. Tune in next time for Daniel chapter 3.